Welcome to the War Corgi YouTube channel, where I'm going to start a series of videos covering the new rank and flank fantasy game by Joseph A. McCullough, and that is called Oathmark. It's produced by Osprey Games. Now, this is going to be the first in a series of videos, as I mentioned, and I'll mention that there's some content already out there on YouTube and various other places. That content varies in quality, and some of it was produced right when the game was released, before the reviewers even played a game. So, with caution, make sure you check out some of that content, but also understand that those are initial hot takes and there's a lot of wrong information about this game out there. One of the unique things about Oathmark is the kingdom building mechanic, and that allows you to draw upon all 5 playable races in the game to build your armies. We'll have a video in the future that discusses how to build your kingdom, but right now I want to discuss those 5 races I just mentioned. So let's get to it. We're going to start our discussion with the humans, and there are a wide variety of units available to them. And like with most fantasy games, they are your baseline, average in most every respect. So the other races that we will cover here are going to be the Elves, Dwarfs, Goblins, and Orcs, but keep in mind that when we discuss those 4 races, it's going to be based off of what we already know and discussed with the human faction. So they have a standard profile of an activation of 5, meaning you roll in general 2 dice, and if one of those 2 10-sided dice is a 5 or higher, you're going to be activating as normal and getting 2 actions. But if you fail to roll at least a 5, that means you're only going to be able to take 1 simple action. So with activation 5, that means you're going to be passing about 84% of your activation rolls, which is pretty reliable. Their movement is 6 inches for their dismounted troops. Their fight is a 2. If they're armed with a missile weapon, their shoot is going to be a 2. And their defense is an 8. Now, of course, defense goes up with light armor to be a 9 and with heavy armor to be a 10. So the humans have all the standard units that you would expect. So we have soldiers, spearmen, archers, warriors, line breakers, and light and heavy catapults. Now, where they differ from the other races are in their other units. So they have a militia unit, which has an activation of +1, meaning that you have to roll a 6. And they're unarmored, so they are really just kind of your screening units that you can afford to give up. If you've seen the movie Braveheart, it's like the English using the Irish in the attack against the Scots. You just send them forward and let them take the brunt of the enemy attack, keeping your other troops fresh. They have Rangers, which is a missile weapon, missile-equipped unit, and they are nimble, meaning that they can move in and out of the woods with ease. And they're also able to use the keyword of aimed fire, allowing them to shoot at not the closest unit, but any unit that they want to. The Mounted Rangers is a really interesting unit, as they have movement of 8, a defense of +1, and aimed fire, but of course they have no armor. So relatively lightly armored, but they can get to places and harass enemy forces with those missile weapons. They have some of the best cavalry in the game, and their medium cavalry sports the charge 3 keyword, their fight +1, and a defense +3. And then they have their heavy cavalry as well, who also have a charge +3, a fight +1, and defense 3. It is very difficult to stop heavy cavalry on the charge. Matter of fact, if you can, you're going to want to try to blunt their attack by striking them first. Now their magic users, again, are kind of your baseline standard. They do have 3 spells, and I'm going to be looking at 3 spells for each of the races, just to kind of discuss what they do. And the first one's going to be Sunblind. That's going to prevent an enemy missile unit from shooting that round. Stolen March, which allows you to move one of your units for a free action outside of their activation. And then Seize the Initiative, which allows you to roll 4 dice instead of 2 when determining the initiative for each round. So it's just kind of some general spell support for your humans. Nothing really too special there with most of the magic, but it does allow you to do some fun things. So a magic user is a nice thing to bring along if you're bringing some humans with you. Now we move on to an interesting faction. That's going to be the Elves. The Elves boast the best fighters and archers in the game. Now they are extremely expensive for that, but they have the ability to dominate difficult terrain. Not much need for commanders, and their high activation makes them very reliable for magic support. So compared to a standard human, their profile is activation 3. They have +1 to all of their fight skills and +1 to all of their shoot skills. They also have the standard units of soldiers, spearmen, archers with a twist in that they have aimed fire, meaning that they don't have to shoot the closest target, warriors, and the line breakers. Now their more specialized units include the rangers, and they're really interesting because in addition to that shoot +1, which makes them a shoot 3, they also have a fight +1 that comes standard with the elven profile. So this is a missile weapon that you can run around in the woods and still do a little bit of damage if somebody charges into them. They have the ability to fight back. But if you want even better fighters in the woods, then we have the Path Guard, who also have the nimble keyword, and by far the best infantry in any sort of rough terrain. So they're going to be at a fight 3, which is better than almost any other infantry unit in the game, but able to run around nimbly through any sort of rough terrain. Their mounted rangers are very good, kind of like the human mounted rangers, but they're sporting one better fight and one better shoot. Their cavalry is extremely good and extremely expensive at 70 points per model, but they, like the humans, have a charge +3, and then they have their fight +1 and defense +3 for being mounted on those horses. So really, pound for pound, just as good as the human cavalry, maybe even a little bit better with their activation of 3, but certainly more expensive. You have the Huntmaster, which is maybe the most interesting unit in the game. And by interesting, I mean it's different from any other unit that we have so far. They have a movement of 8, and it's an Elven Huntmaster with no armor, making his defense an 8. And then he's surrounded by up to 19 dogs. So you'd have a really large, fast unit. Now, normally your cavalry units, since they're on a 25 by 50 millimeter base, you can only have a total of 10 of those in any unit. But the Huntmaster, bringing along 19 dogs, you have a very big, very numerous, very fast unit with very little defense. And I don't know. I'm curious to see how they play. I haven't played with them yet. Instead of they're the only race that doesn't have light and heavy catapults, instead having ballistas. So that is their long-range artillery support. Now their magic is certainly interesting, as the most expensive magic user in the game. And to give you an idea of what kind of spells you can bring along with an elven wizard, you have True Flight, which allows them to cast it on a missile-equipped unit and get +1 to their shoot. So now you're looking at a missile-equipped unit with like a shoot +4. True Sight, which allows that missile unit or a missile unit is cast on to ignore one friendly unit between them and their target. And then Pathfinder, in case you just don't have enough elves running around the woods, you can cast that on any unit and give them nimble, so they too can be running around at high speed. So altogether, pretty interesting magic support. So now we move on to our third race, which is the Dwarves. The Dwarves are extremely survivable, both in terms of their actual defense and their morale. They're kind of slow in plotting, as you might expect, and interestingly, there's no organic cavalry support for them to draw upon. So if you want cav in your kingdom, you're going to have to ally with one of the other races. Their profile difference is different from humans in that their activation number is at 4. They have -1 to their movement, and then +1 to all their defenses. So their standard units include soldiers, spearmen, archers, warriors, line breakers, and light and heavy catapults, and I think they make some of the best infantrymen in the game with a combination of their low activation and their high defense. The other units that they bring along with them are the Border Guard. Those Border Guard are a lot like the human rangers in that they have nimble and they have aim fire, and they're able to just kind of run around the woods or the ruins and shoot their missile weapons at incoming targets, not necessarily the closest one. A really interesting addition to the dwarf list is their militia. Now, where the human militia were just kind of throwaway units, the dwarf militia is a little bit different. Their activation is a -1, just like the humans. So that means their activation number becomes a 5, but they sport two-handed weapons, which give them an additional fight +1. So they're looking for 3s. I'm sorry, their fight is a 3, which is as good as their line breakers. So, you know, while they're not incredibly well defended like some of their other units. They still have a defense of a 9 thanks to that inherent +1 defense that the Dwarfs get, but then the ability to really smash some units with that 3 fight. As I mentioned earlier, there is no cavalry for this particular race. Now, the magic spells that I'm going to focus on here, and the magic users cost about the average, the same as the humans, are ones that really bolster what the Dwarves already do well, just like the Elves kind of bolstered what they did well. And the first one is going to be Fortress, and that allows a unit to gain Shielded 3 until they next move. Now, the way shielding works in this game is all units are capped at 5 combat dice, so you can't throw more than 5 per combat. And if you use shielding, you subtract 1 dice for each level of shielding. This is really good against incoming missile fire, as maybe a unit of bowmen are shooting them, they would normally throw 5 dice. You can use your shielding 3 and reduce it to 2. Now, it does prevent you from moving, but sometimes dwarves just want to stay where they're at, so it's very thematic. Gathering of Crows is a similar spell, but allows your dwarves to gain Shielded 2 just against missile attacks. They are slow in plotting, as I mentioned before, so as they're moving across the battlefield, you kind of want to save some of your combat power from the attrition that missile units are going to try to be levying upon them, and Gathering of Crows is a great spell to do that with. And then they have a really interesting offensive spell, which is called Lightning Bolt, which is Strength 6, Command Dice 1, or Combat Dice 1, so you're throwing 1 dice, but that dice is a champion dice, so you can really do some real damage on either a unit or maybe just one single monster. Gives them a lot of flexibility on who they can target there. So once again, dwarf spellcasting is very interesting. When you look at all the spellcasters, they all bring their own unique talents to the battlefield. And I'm just covering some of their spells here, but the 3 I just mentioned are 3 very good ones, I will add. So now let's talk about some goblins. Goblins are the cheapest troops in the game, great in numbers, but prone to morale problems. They really require commanders for reliability if you want them to get their 2 actions per activation. And remember that moving into melee is not a simple action, so you really do need those commanders. They have the only access to light cavalry in the game, which is their Wolf Riders. We'll cover those in detail later. But it's important to remember that one of the keywords that they get, charge, is easily negated by enemy spearmen. So their basic profile differs from the humans in that their activation number is a 6. You're still activating 75% of the time if you're rolling 2 dice, but that goes up again if you have a commander within range and get to roll 3 dice. But it does start to hurt them in the morale department as they lose guys. All goblins just about have the charge 1 keyword, which means if they do the charging instead of being charged for melee, that they get +1 to their fight. But their general fight score is a -1 and their shoot is a -1. So not very good soldiers and archers, but with rank bonuses you can certainly make up for that, and as cheap as these guys are, you'll have your rank bonuses. So they have the standard units of soldiers, spearmen, archers, and a light catapult. And interestingly, the light catapult doesn't suffer the -1 shoot penalty that the rest of the goblins have. I guess they just have an inherent ability and understanding of how artillery works, which I'm good with. They have a number of other units. The first one is going to be the slaves. Now with an activation +1, that means you have to roll 7 on these guys, and their fight is a 0. So the only way you're going to be able to get that fight number up is to have a number of ranks. These guys really are throwaway troops. You can get a ton of them for a little bit of points. If you're running at an enemy and they have a lot of just regular non-elven archer units, they're going to be forced to shoot at the slaves as the closest unit, and you're really not going to mind losing those. If you want your slaves to maybe do a little bit more before they get taken off the board, you can invest in slave slingers. Now they have a short range missile weapon, but they're also activation 7 and a shoot of 0. So you're having to get them really close and hope they have some ranks left before you can throw a couple of rocks at the enemy. It's an interesting option, but I'm not sure it'd be one that I take very often. But this is something I would love to take very often, and that is going to be the Wolf Rider. The Wolf Rider is the light cavalry unit in the game. They're going to have a charge 2, defense +2, and remember, goblins don't suffer a -1 on defense, it's only their fight and shoot rolls, and a fight +1. So they're at a fight 2 and their defense is up to 11. They can really do some damage, but more importantly, they can harass enemy units in the rear or on the flanks. If you want to try to get some of that harassment done with some missile units, they have the Wolf Rider Scouts. Their charge goes down to 1, but they have aimed fire, so they can shoot at whoever they want and can see. They still get that defense +2, and they still get that fight +1. Shoot 1 makes it a little bit tough for them, but the fact that you can go ahead and get them behind the enemy lines and pick out your targets makes that shoot +1 a little bit more acceptable to use. Now, Orcs and Goblins share the same spell book, so I'm going to concentrate on the 2 spells for the Goblins, and it's worth noting that Goblins have the least expensive magic users in the game. The first one's going to be Poison Cloud, and you can cast that at a unit and you roll 5 dice, and if you roll under that unit's activation number, they're going to take a damage, and whether or not they take any damage, you're going to get a -1 to your fight for the rest of the turn. So where Goblins might struggle against human heavy cavalry with their high defense number, or maybe a giant with a high defense number, Poison Cloud can really even the odds up a little bit for them. Both those units have relatively high activation numbers. Now obviously this gets worse and worse as you move from Dwarves to Elves and then maybe a dragon. So you're wanting to cast this at other units with high activation numbers, making Orcs and Goblins a really good target. Fear, I think, is a quintessential spell for these guys. It allows you to make an enemy unit take a morale test, and if they fail that test, they become disordered. Now, you can't cast it on a unit that's already disordered in the hopes that they flee off the board, but just the effect of disordering another unit makes them fight worse, it makes them save for morale worse, and it really puts some fear into your opponent as that unit is one step closer to leaving the battlefield by fleeing. So the last faction that we're going to talk about are the Orcs, and they are just beef. Wild Charge is one of their keywords, and it's great for units with champions, as the ability to reroll a champion dice is phenomenal. Like Goblins, they also require commanders for reliability, and charge is easily negated by spearmen. So when we look at their profile, they're activation 6, just like Goblins, but they don't suffer the -1 fight and -1 shoot that Goblins do. They have charge 1 like Goblins, but they also have that special ability, Wild Charge. And as I mentioned earlier, it's really good for champions. Wild Charge allows you to reroll one of your dice after you throw them for combat, but the downside is your opponent also gets to reroll one of their dice as well. But if you miss with that champion dice, and champion dice have the ability to do an additional wound when you roll it, it might be worth the gamble at that point. Matter of fact, I'm going to take that gamble every time with Orcs. But maybe you hit with your champion dice and you just miss with the regular dice. Maybe at that point you don't use the Wild Charge. It's situational dependent, but I really like that ability, and I think it plays well into your Orc archetypes. So their standard units, and all they have as standard units, are soldiers, spearmen, archers, warriors, and line breakers. These are the heavy hitters if you're going to pair them up with the Goblins. Now these are 2 separate races. They're often lumped together, but you actually need separate territories to run Orcs and Goblins. But if you do run them together, you know, line breakers are going to be the ones that really get in there behind maybe some Goblin slaves and knock some skulls together. Or if you're running them with humans, same thing. Their ability to get that charge 1 keyword and that Wild Charge off makes them really good. Now they don't have any other units besides those standard units, so there's not too much to talk about there, but I do want to talk about their magic. For reasons, their magic users have a defense +1. Now all magic users in the game, none of them wear armor, which means they're at the baseline 8 defense, except for Dwarves, of course, with their defense +1 means it's a 9. Orcs without armor would normally be a defense 8, but again, for reasons, their magic users are defense 9, so that makes them a little bit more survivable. 2 spells I'd like to highlight are Battle Rage and Horrify. Battle Rage allows you to just pick a unit that does not have a champion or a hero in it and upgrade the officer from a regular officer to a champion. So combined with that Wild Charge that I've been harping on about, makes it really powerful. The other one is Horrify, and you can just imagine that a unit of Orcs is already pretty horrific, but horrify is a keyword in the game. Makes your opponent roll one less dice when they're rolling for their morale. So if you get a big unit of line breakers and do some damage to a nice expensive unit of elves who normally have a pretty good activation at 3, you make them take a morale test. And if they're doing it on 1 dice instead of 2, the activation of 3, along with any modifiers they have for taking casualties in combat, starts to get a little scary for them. So that's why I like horrify with the Orcs. Altogether, once again, really interesting spellcraft available to them. So that's going to conclude our discussion of the 5 playable races. Now there are a whole host of monsters and giant infantry out there that I haven't even begun to just talk about yet, but maybe in a future segment we certainly can. But I think for the next one, what I'm going to do is focus on my kingdom, which will be a combination of humans and elves, and how I went about building that and how I see that operating in the future. So hopefully you enjoyed this discussion. If you haven't had ability to check out Oathmark and you are interested in a really, really neat rank and flank fantasy war game, I highly encourage you to do it. Make sure you check out the links in the notes below. And also, if you haven't liked and subscribed to the channel, but you're interested in more Oathmark content, recommend that you do that, because we will have more on this because it's really caught my fancy. So thanks for listening. Let me know what you think down in the comments. If you have anything that you want to say about the various factions, I'd love to hear it. Otherwise, maybe join us over on the Facebook or on the Oathmark Discord so we can discuss these topics in depth. Until next time, guys, take care. Bye-bye.